Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us for Research Bites. My name is Audrey Catalano, and I'm the program coordinator here at the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture. The monthly Research Bites series is one of many programs that we've initiated to engage scholars, students, staff, and community members in interdisciplinary scholarship and programming around the topics of race and ethnicity. Thank you to Tiara, our center's program administrator, for thinking up and bringing to life the series, and thank you to Taylor Pate and Ndidi Opara, our multimedia and marketing assistants, for their work behind the scenes. Our goal for this series is to connect staff from across the university with faculty affiliates of the center who study, teach, and write about race and ethnicity. We wanted to create an informal and interactive space where staff can learn firsthand about some of the exciting research happening on campus, and to provide an opportunity for faculty and staff to network with hope that we will find some shared interests and possibilities for future collaborations. You can subscribe to our Research Bites and CSRPC listservs to be notified of future conversations. The first 25 staff members to register for Research Bites events will receive a $20 Grubhub credit to buy lunch on us. Congrats to those who are enjoying their lunches right now. Today, we are joined by a very special guest, Associate Professor Gina Fedock. Gina Fedock is an Associate Professor at the Crown Family School of Social Work, Policy, and Practice at the University of Chicago. Her research agenda builds on scholarship that regards the criminal legal system as embodying forms of gendered and racialized social control. Across this work, she highlights the role of institutional and system-related sources of suffering for women, and points to new directions, especially for the field of social work, regarding needed multi-level interventions to improve women's mental health and well-being. One of her current studies uses a reproductive justice framework to examine how incarcerated women employ strategies of resistance to navigate dehumanizing barriers to parenting and reclaim their right to parent with dignity. Please give a warm welcome to our friend, faculty member, Gina Fedock.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you for all of you for attending today. I really appreciate the opportunity to share about this work. So I'm going to share my screen. Can folks see the slides? Large screen.
Yes,
Great.
good.
Great. All right, wonderful. Thank you. So again, my name is Gina Fedock. My pronouns are she, her, hers. And today I'll be talking about incarcerated mothers and the right to parent with dignity. Now, there is a tradition with these research bites to share childhood pictures. And so here are some pictures of me as a child. I'm the shorter one in the pictures with my sister. And there's a picture of me with my mother in the corner, which is a complicated relationship. And in thinking about baby pictures, childhood pictures, I also felt remiss if I didn't share about my own children, pictures of my own children. And as we're talking about motherhood, this sort of reflection on my own experiences as a mother. So I want to say that in preparing this talk, and even just going back through baby pictures and childhood pictures, I had a range of feelings, some of which were joy at remembering these moments, as well as some grief for things that had passed. And some feelings of, I wonder what it will be like to look back on this moment, you know, when the future arrives, what will it feel like here? I specifically, today, we're going to be talking about incarcerated mothers, and I'm going to spend some time giving sort of an overview of the project and an overview of really the landscape of what parenting in prison looks like, some of the dynamics and some of the factors that impact it. And at the end of towards the end of the presentation, we'll be talking about visions of the future from incarcerated mothers. And so I wanted to include this one picture of my children because I had this moment of really thinking back to my own sort of engagement with my futures. And this is a picture in which it was in 2019, it was my birthday in July, and I took my children to the Botanical Gardens in Ann Arbor. Now, I used to live in Ann Arbor. Before having children, I got my MSW at the University of Michigan, and I also worked there. And after working my 9-to-5 job there, I would sometimes go to the Botanical Gardens and go on a walk, run, jog, run, quick walk as a way to sort of process the day But I also spent a lot of time dreaming about being a mom. It was really important to me. And as a queer woman, there are lots of logistics that go into it, a lot of intentional planning. And in 2019, which was basically about 10 years post that walk run, I took my children to the same path. And I'd taken them to the children's garden up until age 3. We had moved to Chicago whenever they were around 3. So this is their first time really like returning to the garden, but their first time on this path with me. And I just had this moment of thinking of like, here's my future actualized. You know, the 10 years ago me, if she could see me now in terms of here are these children that I dreamed for. And so I also think it's interesting to look at the vision of my son holding binoculars and kind of looking into the future himself. But as part of this work today, again, we're going to be talking about incarcerated mothers. We're going to be talking about parenting with dignity, what that looks like, what it could look like, and visions of the future. And I just wanted to really spotlight that sort of yearning of making the future into something that's actualized. Today, you're going to hear me use the word we. And none of the work that I've done has been solo. And I've learned so much from the people that I work with and I continue to work with and learn with and grow with. And so these are some of the folks. This was part of a bigger research project that was funded by the Joint Research Fund with Chapin Hall. Mary and Malcolm went with me to do interviews within the prison. Carly Murray has been very instrumental in the transcriptions and initial analyses. The work today heavily pulls from the work done with Selena Doria, and we continue to do a variety of work with this project. Sheila Schenker is also involved in a lot of the analyses processes. So this has been definitely a team effort. It's not reflective of everyone, but I'm very appreciative. So this is the we. I also want to say another word about language. So today I'm using the term incarcerated mothers, and this is based on the participants in our research study that I'll be talking about today. All the folks that we interviewed who are incarcerated identified as women and identified as mothers. I just want to be mindful that for folks who are incarcerated in prisons designated for women, not all are women, and so that term is not fully inclusive. And I also want to call attention to the fact that the criminal legal system has been a tool and a process that has reinforced our gender binary, that it's part of criminalizing any forms of gender expansive ways of being. So if we're arrested, one of our first points of process is, you know, are we going to be put with men or are we going to be put with women? And that system doesn't reflect people's lives. And it's intended partly to criminalize, those forms of gender expansiveness. So I want to be mindful of that term that, again, is based in this research. As another point, I also want to mention that I'm going to share some national statistics that are based in that binary. So I just want to point that out. So in the spirit of sharing pictures, I have a picture from the film Tutwiler, which is a film about incarcerated mothers. There's a Julia Tutwiler prison for women in Alabama, and that's where the film is based in. I'll put a link in the chat afterwards. It's freely available to watch on the Marshall on PBS. So what we see here is actually a group of incarcerated mothers sharing pictures of their children. And some of them have multiple photos, and some of them have only one. So for example, one woman shares in the film that she only has one picture of her daughter, and she wonders what her baby daughter's cries sound like. It's not something she gets to experience. Other mothers have children who've grown older, still minor age children, but children who are older. So I think this picture is important for multiple reasons. One, to spotlight the heterogeneity and experiences of mothering while incarcerated. Two, to point out the sort of range of losses that aren't often acknowledged or captured in a lot of our mainstream or dominant narratives about forms of losses. And three, I think it's important to point out the sort of collectivity, how important it is to be able to share and how much support folks who are incarcerated give to each other in these experiences that are very particular to being incarcerated. So in talking about incarcerated mothers, first of all, since the 1970s, we've seen an over 800% increase in the number of women incarcerated in the United States. Over half are mothers of minor age children, so children under the age of 18. Over half were also the primary caregivers of their children prior to incarceration. And this is a much higher number when compared to fathers who are incarcerated. And partly this factor, being the primary caregiver, contributes to women's children ending up with extended family members or friends, but also we see that incarcerated mothers have one of the highest rates for their children being in the foster care system, the child welfare system, and they're one of the populations that has the highest rate of experiencing termination of parental rights. We also see that about 38% of people are pregnant when they enter prisons, and prisons are different from jails in the sense that you enter prison once you've been convicted and sentenced. So typically you're serving a sentence that's 3 years or longer, can be up to multiple life sentences. So 38% of people are pregnant when they enter prisons, and almost half receive no prenatal care. We've also seen issues over time with correctional staff continuing to shackle, which basically means handcuffing pregnant people around their wrists as well as their ankles. So shackling during the process of labor and delivery and the hours that they get with their infant. This has been considered a human rights violation. There have been efforts to change policies, and I want to stress that most correctional departments still allow a provision that if there's a quote unquote security risk, they can still shackle. So this has been considered a major issue around birth justice. I also want to present another picture from the film Tutwiler, and this is one of the main women in the film. You see her be taken in the prison van to give birth in a hospital, and then returning to the prison about 24, 36 hours later. And as she enters the prison, there's no institutional recognition of what she's just experienced. And again, most people who deliver babies who are incarcerated only get 48 to 72 hours with that baby before the baby is removed and placed with family or within, with a social service agency. And so again, this notion of there's no real recognition of this major loss within prison institutions. In doing this work and talking about incarcerated mothers and doing this research, we always have to keep in mind various dynamics and policies and practices. So these are some of those that are really key to guiding our research. First, whenever I mention the increase in the number of women incarcerated, this is driven by macro level factors. So we hear the phrase mass incarceration, but we really want to think about mass criminalization. Who is being criminalized and for what ways and in what, who's experiencing that sort of disproportionality and how is that linked to systemic racism and gendered social control? So Kimberly Crenshaw and other colleagues had a conference several years ago in which they called it being over-policed and underprotected, to particularly spotlight the way that Black women and other women of color experience this sort of hyper criminalization from the state, as well as receiving very few actual tangible resources and supports from the state. And so this factor of there's more focus on the criminalization as part of that process of racialized gendered social control. So for our work, we're always drawing from historical and ongoing legacies of these forms of systems of power. So for example, we draw from the work of Sarah Haley, the work of Beth Ritchie with Arrested Justice. We've also seen with the increase in the number of women incarcerated that there's been a significant increase in the number of children in foster care with an incarcerated mother. So national research has looked at what are the driving factors for the increase in number of children in foster care. And actually maternal incarceration is one of the major leading factors that has driven this. So we also pull from the work of Dorothy Roberts and other critical scholars that are really looking at these intersections of the criminal legal system and the child welfare system, the ways that they criminalize, the way that they enact punitive policies and practices, particularly towards Black women and other women of color. So part of this work is also drawing from Patricia Hill Collins, who has looking at our controlling images. So really diving into what are our notions of who's quote unquote a good mother, who's a bad mother, who's allowed to be a parent, whose motherhood identities are given legitimacies, whose are questions, who are pathologized. These are the sort of dynamics we're always looking at. And then we're also paying attention to sort of the intersections and what's happening in terms of policies and practices in everyday settings, particularly within prisons. So for example, with the Adoption and Safe Families Act of 1997, the goal was to reduce the number of children in foster care. And it set this sort of time frame that once a child's in foster care, there's 24 months to where they have to be moved to permanency. And permanency is either being returned to their family or a termination of parental rights. Well, again, thinking about prisons, as most sentences are beyond 2 years, and this move to permanency often happens around that 15th to 18th month. This is a policy that has been especially detrimental to this population. So again, in talking about gendered, racialized social control, most of our work has been here in Illinois within the largest prison designated for women, and that's Logan Correctional Center. It's located in Lincoln, Illinois, which is about 3 to 4 hours from Chicago. That 4 hours can be expanded depending on weather and traffic day. And about 40% of women there are from Chicago. So I also want to stress to you that Decatur Correctional Center, which is the other prison designated for women, is also a similar distance. And again, these are located in very rural areas of the state. So if you've ever had a car trip with a toddler, with an infant, with a 10-year-old, with multiple children, I want you to think for a moment about packing them into a car, driving 3 to 4 hours to this rural area, having to go through security, being in a crowded, loud room, visiting someone who can't walk around, who has to stay seated, who may get yelled at, where there are limited food options, limited bathrooms, maybe having a 2-hour visit, 3-hour visit, and then having to turn around and make that drive back. And to think about how taxing that is, right? So one of the key aspects is this geographic isolation creates many breakages in these relationships. And also talking about gendered, racialized social control, we have seen historically and currently that correctional staff often say that they prefer to work with men than women. Again, they're working with this binary that's not reflective. And they often say that one of the reasons they don't want to work with women is because they're too talkative, they're too emotional, they're manipulative. And this always is also racialized. So first of all, that's sort of a gender description, and it also incorporates many racialized dynamics. So you can see in this last picture, it's a sticky paper from a training that was done with correctional staff at Logan in 2019. And it was activity in which they identified how they view the women who are incarcerated there. And they described them as needy, loud, entitled, dirty, carefree, disrespectful, wild, immature, argumentative, low self-esteem, abuse victims, broken families, poor, mental abuse, bad male role model, poor parenting. So I just want to share that the very first time I went to Logan Correctional Facility and I met with the warden at that time, she said that she was doing training with staff. And partly because they would see any sort of talking by women who are incarcerated there as argumentative and as something to write them up with misconduct ticket. And she particularly talked about how the staff is almost all white. And they particularly see whenever Black women or other women of color start using their hands to talk, it's seen as acts of aggression, right? So when we think about gendered racialized control, it permeates everyday factors. Again, it's permeating who's getting in trouble for what, who has access to what resources and why. It's permeating the daily interactions. We can also see when we're talking about this, when we look at prisons designated for men, we often see educational opportunities related to plumbing, auto mechanics, welding. When we look at prisons for women, we often see cosmetology, which is fine for some women, but isn't always meeting all the needs or areas of work that folks incarcerated there would like to do. I've also included 2 pictures from the dog training program. I realize they're a little blurry, but this is the program that is offered at Logan. And what we've heard in our interviews and what we've also seen in being in this housing unit is that it's primarily offered to white women. It is also the highest paying job within the prison. So as we're talking about incarcerated mothers, we also want to look at dynamics of how much women have to, or how much mothers have to pay to parent. That you're paying for phone calls, you're paying for stamps, you're paying for envelopes and gifts for your children, and to also see that sort of racial stratification within even pay. So the research that I'll be talking about today was really driven out of a very practical purpose. As a social worker, a lot of times practicality does drive what we do. So there was the passage several years ago of the Women's Correctional Service Act in the state of Illinois, and it had this line around having gender-responsive policies, practices, programs, and services that are family-centered, but that wasn't really defined. Women's Justice Institute has been doing work for a while, and they've been doing in-depth work, and they had done an in-depth evaluation. And they also recommended developing a comprehensive strategy to address the needs of incarcerated mothers and reduce the harmful impact of incarceration on their children. And again, that wasn't fully defined. They also started a statewide task force for implementation of recommendations and the act, and to reduce the number of incarcerated women by 50%. So we initially started this study as a way to make sure that the perspectives of incarcerated women in Illinois were at the table, and to actually talk with them about, like, what are the impacts on your parenting? What would help reduce this harmful impact? So we did a survey of all the people housed there, as well as did interviews with incarcerated mothers. To guide this work, we use a reproductive justice framework. So reproductive justice is a praxis, it's a framework, it's a movement that was developed by Black feminist activists in the 1990s. It was also many folks who were included in it, particularly trans and gender expansive folks, people working in sex work, people who experience the harms of the immigration immigration system. And it was partly this praxis and movement to address the limitations and lack of attention to power that were embedded within white feminist conceptualizations of reproductive choice. So reproductive justice is, when we're just focused on the sort of pro-life, pro-choice, or we're thinking of reproductive choice as just abortion care access, we're ignoring these legacies and ongoing patterns of the denial of ability to have a child, the ability to not have a child, their ability to parent, that particularly folks who are not in that white feminist movement experience. So reproductive justice is based in 3 central tenets: the right to have a child, the right not to have a child, and the right to raise children in safe and healthy environments and with dignity. And it includes, as it's critical, a power analysis, and it's fundamentally a framework about power. And so it is a framework, and again, a praxis that encourages us to think and act expansively, to really look at what would have to happen to uphold these 3 tenets. So for example, from Ross and Solinger, they say achieving reproductive justice requires access to specific community-based resources, including high-quality healthcare, housing and education, a living wage, a healthy environment, and a safety net for times when these resources fail. So when using this, we really want to consider this work for our research, this framework for our research. And also there's been attention in the recent years to how incarcerated mothers face various forms of reproductive injustices. We see the intersections between mass incarceration, systemic racism, structural violence, and gendered social control. All of these forces are inherently compromising incarcerated mothers' bodily autonomy and reproductive justice. So we wanted to pay attention to forms of reproductive injustice, in particular, that incarcerated mothers were experiencing. To do so, we did conduct interviews with 42 incarcerated mothers and minor-aged children. We did interviews where we did life history calendars where we focused on their time during incarceration. You can see that we had a racially diverse sample, an average of 2 minor-aged children. Almost half the sample had some involvement in the child welfare system with at least 1 child. And we purposefully sampled to make sure we had racially diverse sample, as well as some women with experiences with the child welfare system, some with contact, without contact, some time left, a lot of time left. We tried to be inclusive and be attentive to all these dynamics. For our analysis, we engaged in multiple iterative rounds of coding, and then developing and looking at emergent themes. We engaged in constant sort of coding and comparison, refinement, interpretation. And in particular, because the notion of quote unquote parenting in prison is inherently a tense, contradictory sort of experience, we particularly paid attention to power dynamics, contradictions, and tensions. So I'm going to present some of our results from our various work to kind of set this landscape again around parenting before I move into how these forms are resisted, and how incarcerated mothers are envisioning something different. So first, we saw that parenting from prison really requires using phones as the primary way of parenting. I should say there is voluminous literature and research about incarcerated mothers. And again, our study was really based on wanting to include the perspectives of those folks here in Illinois and bringing it to shape policy and practice. So some of our findings really reiterate what other studies have found, and we've also sought to extend or deepen some of this work too. So first, due to that geographic isolation, again, most incarcerated mothers are parenting via phones. This is their way of checking in, even asking about homework, how their children are doing. We also found that, especially through the survey, that less than 1/3 of the children of incarcerated mothers live within 2 hours. So especially thinking about how much work it takes, about 30% of our survey sample with everyone, only about 30% had regular visits in person from their children. So we can say right away that, in terms of thinking about the right to parent with dignity, in particular from the reproductive justice framework, we see that there are blockages to that right away from physical separation and isolation. I want to point out that these are pictures from the reunification ride, which is a free bus that goes once a month to Logan so that children can visit their moms. And they're always seeking funding, so I'd be happy to share information about that. We also heard from incarcerated mothers that parenting from prison incorporates many unacknowledged losses. So, for example, some women talked about having their rights terminated and how then they weren't considered mothers anymore, that the prison wouldn't offer them parenting classes because they had experienced that. But there was no way to talk about that loss. Or the loss of contact when a child moved out of state or whenever they lost that contact, either unexpectedly or in a sort of more planned way. We also heard many descriptions of ambiguous loss, this sort of uncertainty, this sense of we're disconnected, will we or won't we reconnect? And how do I sort of mourn someone who's still here, still living, but isn't physically here? And we heard many threats to parenting practices, and the motherhood status, especially in terms of experiences with the child welfare system. So some women described experiences of being lied to by their caseworkers, of various experiences that made them feel like that system wanted them to lose their child, as one of our participants said. So again, we think about these sort of losses that are connected again to blocking the sort of right to parent with dignity. As an illustration of these sort of unacknowledged losses, again, it's not just the loss of communication, it's a loss of like what that all represents. So one of our participants said, I feel like I don't see my daughter. I don't know her. I don't know if her favorite color is still purple. I know she doesn't watch Dora the Explorer anymore. I don't know her shoe size. I don't know how long her hair is. I don't know how she talks. I don't know her stature. I don't know how she walks. Right, so again, thinking about these losses connected to that loss of contact. In terms of ambiguous loss, here's another quote that's an example. One participant said, I don't think that committing a crime or getting caught up in a situation, it doesn't stop you from being a parent. Going to prison doesn't stop you from being. It doesn't mean that you're no longer a mother. You're guilty. I may be guilty of a crime, or some people not guilty of a crime, but I'm not guilty of not being a mother. And I think if most people get that and understand that when a mother is sentenced, their child is sentenced too. Their children are sentenced too. And it's one thing to lose someone. The worst loss you have is someone that's still alive, because you have so many questions. Why can't I have her? Why can't she be here? Why this? We also looked at the sort of everyday experiences of incarcerated mothers. And we used the framework of slow violence to really spotlight these forms of daily abuse and violence that incarcerated mothers experience. So at the beginning, when I mentioned that there's been a lot of attention to birth justice, whenever someone gives birth who's incarcerated and then their infant is removed, This is often seen as a very dramatic loss. It's something that's identifiable as a traumatic incident or a traumatic experience. And slow violence really, as a framework, asks us to adjust how we look for forms of violence, that we look at what happens slowly over time, what is harmful, and its sort of gradual effects. And also as a framework that helps us think about different scales of time. So let me try to put this into, I'll try to be more descriptive about this. In almost every interview, women talked about the inadequate phones within the prison. So in a housing unit, there's typically around 150 people, and there could be 2 or 3 phones available. Now, you may be assigned a phone time from 10 a.m. to noon. If you have a school-age child, 10 a.m. to noon is not going to work Monday through Friday to be able to talk to that child. And so that can mean an actual loss of being able to communicate with them. Or if your phone time is 4 to 6 p.m., maybe you do get to talk to them. But the other issue is with the inadequate phones, people are often waiting in lines. Many women talked about the fact that often the phones are broken. They either don't work well or they're completely broken. And so you may have a designated time that would work to be able to talk to your child. But the question is, can you actually be able to talk to them given the lines and given the inadequate phones? And this is something that staff see and nothing is done, right? And so slow violence also pays attention to the ways in which this is both visible and invisible, to whom, what are the lack of responses as well as the responses, who's being impacted by it. And we particularly paid attention to the scales of time that incarcerated mothers talked about. So, going a month without speaking to your child means you may miss an important holiday. You may miss an important school test. You may miss an important event. And again, that sort of loss related to parenting time. So we intentionally, through this work, wanted to name these experiences as violence, because often in dominant narratives, they're discussed as deprivations of prisons, or just the way they are. But instead wanting to name this as violence and look at harms over time. We also described a lot of the environmental toxins. You can see pictures from the John Howard Association, conditions of mold, raccoon infestations. Women talked about family members getting sick whenever they came in. And then also, to think about this work as around looking at the everyday forms of reproductive oppressions, including the right to parent with dignity. One of the most common narratives or we've seen really in the last few years an attention to paying attention to how women in prison in particular have very high rates of experiencing interpersonal victimization across the life course. They're a population with high rates of childhood and adulthood forms of physical, sexual abuse, intimate partner violence, and other forms of victimization. So we have one aspect of our work where we looked at how some of those experiences of abuse continue. So we looked at ongoing intimate partner violence by an outside partner during incarceration that impacted contact with their children. We also heard about staff verbal and sexual abuse for women who are incarcerated. So you can see these 2 quotes here. Women describe staff saying things like, if you're so worried about your kid, you wouldn't have done what you did. Or one woman said, some of them, staff, call us bitches. They just dog us. They treat us like we're caged up, and it's horrible. We also heard women describe how there was one family counselor who was a correctional staff member who would say, you can come talk to your child on the telephone in my office, but you have to do something sexual in order to be able to have access to the phone. Right? So we see this connection between this, the issue with phones contributing to these experiences of sexual abuse and sexual violence. And I think it's important to name that wanting whatever is wanted while you're incarcerated is easily leveraged for exploitation and abuse by staff. We also heard women discuss challenging power dynamics with the caregivers of their children as well, which contributed to being difficult to parent with dignity. So across these abuse experiences, we're seeing these sort of undermined motherhood identities and real barriers to parenting. So one of our participants talked about her children being with her mother, and she said, I thought I could control everything that was going on in my children's lives from here. And then I realized I can't. arguing with my mom, and then I just finally realized that I'm powerless over that situation right now. So whatever she's doing for them, I have to kind of be okay with that because there's nothing I can do. And then she's the only one that takes care of me here. So if I get mad at her and then she cuts me off, then I'm just screwed. So many incarcerated mothers talk about having to walk this sort of tightrope with the caregivers and their children, not wanting to anger them or push them away because there's so much at risk if they do. Okay, so across this work, we found many sort of challenges, blockades, disconnections, abuses that restricted, limited, prevented parenting with dignity for incarcerated mothers. So these are just some of the factors in terms of looking at this landscape. The physical disconnection, some women described also experiencing mail from their children would sit in the mailroom for months at end, so they would miss communication and not be able to respond timely. With the video visits, the policy was that only one person could be in the video camera, which is really hard when you have multiple children. You can see these range of different factors. And I just want to be transparent that as a researcher, as a social worker, as a person, this work, and over time, this work started out as being connected to more reformist work. And to me, like, my abolitionist politic has only sharpened and deepened over time, because I think it is important to change some policies. Like, I think it is important for telephone calls to be free, for example. But are we addressing the conditions that lead to wanting to talk to your child? This isn't just about adding in phones, but looking at what are the conditions, all the conditions of abuse and exploitation that keep happening. And what seems to happen is whenever there is one change, then there's another form of exploitation or abuse that pops up somewhere else. And to me, it's just insufficient in terms of just tweaking policies. The other aspect is that when we first sat down, and Selena Doria, I remember talking with her, we developed a plan of the different papers we could write, and it's like all these forms of violence that are happening. And I do think it's important to document. I think it's important to name, to highlight, to document, to share, to talk about this, because this is both a population that's hyper-visible and invisible, as Janet Garcia Halliot talks about in her work. But also, again, it feels like we can't just talk about the violence and we can't just make small tweaks. To sum up this sort of landscape, one of our participants says, prison makes you feel loss, depression, stress. That's what all prisons do anyways. That's what makes you feel that way. Makes you feel like a lost mother. And feeling like we couldn't just focus on the forms of violence. We noticed that in the interviews when women talked about their futures, it had a different energy. And they were talking about the futures in ways that actually talked about parenting with dignity. And so we really wanted to dive into these futures as a way of rethinking our scholarship. So in turning back to reproductive justice framework and praxis, Ross and Solinger talk about how in this context, when we're talking about multiple forms of oppression and violence, that mothering becomes an act of survival, a life-affirming radical resistance to forces that deny our humanity, our interdependence, and even our existence. Radical mothers withstand oppression to create spaces for life that offer a compelling vision of the future. How we imagine and describe different or better futures is a core concern of reproductive justice, which asks, can we stop the injuries long enough to even envision the remedies? And Janet Garcia Halliot, who looks at women's mothering experiences post-incarceration, talks about, particularly from a Black feminist scholarship tradition, that in terms of talking about these forms of violence, we have to also spotlight resistance and agency. And so we wanted to do that with our work and to really ask, how do incarcerated mothers envision their futures? And how do they use envisioning their futures as a strategy of resistance to all these barriers to parenting with dignity? And we found the future as places of possibilities. So for example, you can see one of our participants actually talked about her faith in the future. So there was a discussion of a resolve, a firm determination to be reunited with their children. We heard women also talking about wanting to rebuild their relationship and ultimately to reclaim this motherhood identity and a motherhood position. All these ways of sort of resisting all the factors that are eroding and disrupting their ability to parent with dignity. So in terms of this firm determination, Melissa, these are all pseudonyms. Melissa, one of our participants, said, I have one goal, and that's to get home to my kids. And we heard several women talking about this, that this really drove what their hope was. That was their real focus for whenever they leave the prison. Ashley shared with us, because if you're committed to your child, nothing's going to stand in your way. I took 20 years for something I didn't do, but the time that I was facing, I could have been without her for the rest of my life. It was either 20 years or 56 years if I was found guilty. And I didn't feel like I wanted to risk my life, her life, and my life. I could miss school years, but I'd still be there for graduation, grandbabies, marriage, college, and all of that still. So I want to spotlight the words, nothing's going to stand in your way. We heard some women talking about fighting, this sort of firm determination, this notion of, I will make this happen to be with my children. With Katie, she said something similar. I stayed determined. There's nothing going to hold me back from my kids. Deborah said, I'm not giving up on her, my daughter. I'm never going to stop trying. I have to let you know that no matter what, I've always loved you since day one. Eventually down the line, I'm trying to be your mother. We also heard women talking about rebuilding their relationship with their children. So with Denise, she said, I want to make up. I know I can't make up for what I put them through or, the time loss, but I just want to make the time and the future better. Kiara said, I just worry about when I go home, our relationship. And because I'm not able to talk every day or see my son as much, is he going to be resistant? I don't know how to build a new relationship. I mean, this is my first kid. It kind of was easy in the beginning, and now it's like starting over. It's harder. I worry about that. How to go about being a mother again. I don't know where to start, and this place does not offer a lot. They can tell you they offer a lot, but they don't. So this was sort of a sub-theme within this notion of rebuilding that relationship. That's what's going to happen in the future, but not having any supports and resources. There's no guidebook for how you do that, right? And what does that actually look like? And having to do it sort of solo because of those lack of resources. We heard from Sharon, bond building, like how to build that bond after you lost that time. I think that's big. I think that's really, really big, Like, how do you get out there and build this bond with this new person? Or you've had your child while you're in prison. You don't even know your child. They took your child at the hospital and sent you back to jail. You have to try to have hopefully someone that is going to bring them in. But I mean, how do you emotionally build that bond with your child and establish your place back in as mother? Like, I started out with some type of bond before I left, and even still, I got to figure out how to get back in there. And lastly, Emily shared, my mothers are like, it's okay, mommy. My oldest, it was like devastating that I wasn't there for her senior prom or her prom period, either one of them, or her high school graduation. But her response was, that's okay. You can come to my college one. And I was like, okay, thanks. And she was like, and we'll get to dress up when I get married. And I was like, okay. So there's always something else that they found with me for the future. Like, it's okay, we got this. They, the prison, give no reunification programs here with you and your children. How do I go back to? I've been gone for 4.5 years. Yeah, on the phone and visits, we don't skip a beat, but I'm going to go home and are things still going to be the same? I've been gone a long time and these people don't give you nothing. No, okay, this is like the steps you can do, or this is resources, And lastly, again, our sample was all folks who were mothers of minor age children, and many of them talked about wanting to reclaim that role as a mother in the future. So this notion of I want to be a mom when I get out. I got to fight to gain my daughter's love, to gain her trust, to gain her understanding, to gain that communication, because eventually down the line, I'm trying to be her mother. And lastly, my kids told me they aren't going to have no kids until I get there because they want me in the house with all my grandkids. But I can't wait to get them because it's like when they do have their grandkids, it's my chance to start over. So first of all, thinking about these findings, how we imagine and describe different or better futures is a core concern of reproductive justice. It is so important to document and name these forms of injustices. And how are we also imagining and describing different or better futures? And in the face of reproductive injustices, incarcerated mothers' visions of the future offer imagined possibilities of parenting with dignity through healing, reunification, and reclamation of motherhood identities. And so our question is like, what does it mean? And to really stress through this work, how important it is to use yearning and dreams as sites of priority and knowledge, to use these to guide. I mean, again, to think about social work practice, we haven't created supports, resources for making these dreams actualized. And to really think about what conditions, practices, policies, and resources promote possibilities and visions becoming realities, specifically for this population of women who experience so many forms of oppressive conditions. And what is the meaning of centering desires and this form of reproductive justice in our work? So this has really shaped sort of rethinking also work and to taking more seriously through my research. I can't keep studying just violence, but to really think about how research methods in and of themselves can promote healing processes and to incorporate through these methods and through the work supports for healing, reunification, and reclamation, and really rethinking, trying to use more creativity. And there's so many folks doing this work, and so really shifting to be in community with them and to learn with them. So for example, so far Sheila Schenker is already doing some work around how mothers are working towards this future using this data. Selena Doria has been really instrumental in starting, we've been doing body mapping focus groups with women living in the community after incarceration and using the opportunity to be in a group setting with other folks with shared experience. And also we're starting a new study that's really post-incarceration and just think about more like healing, reunification, and reclamation. So I know I'm kind of at time, but I just want to say thank you for listening. Thank you for attending. This closing with my pictures of the kids at the botanical gardens and, thinking about, again, that actualization of our future dreams. So thank you again, and I will stop sharing so we can discuss. And I see some questions in the chat. I see a question, 2 questions. So it looks like there's a question. Is there any model anywhere in the world that does a better job of treating incarcerated mothers and their children with dignity and in line with the reproductive justice framework you identify? And COVID. Okay. So, for example, in Perth, Australia, they have a few prisons, one of which is based in the community, and it's set up as a mini community. It's there are houses where women can be with their children. There's a mini post office, a grocery store, So they're models, but ultimately this idea of it's a carceral setting with sort of carceral logics and carceral dynamics. And it's really complicated in thinking about are there sites that do quote unquote less harm? And yeah, anyway, so I'm seeing other questions, but it's still, there are some models that are more community-based, but then there become questions of the surveillance that happens and how that impacts parenting practices. And there's a researcher, Haney, who's done a really great job. I can maybe send it out afterwards around sort of identifying some of those dynamics around parenting. I also see a question from Catherine. There's a proposed rebuild of Logan and Stateville impacted incarcerated mothers. Also with COVID, one of the things with COVID was that it really messed up in-person visits. And one of the first sites that closed with the beginning of COVID was releasing any sort of pregnant people or any of the moms and babies units where there were children. So very complicated as well, but it has set up more video visits, which becomes easier for folks who live farther away, but then it also has had the backlash of preventing in-person visits in some cases. And so it's always these sort of trade-offs within the system that causes a lot of harm. So the governor announced that there's going to be a shutdown and a rebuild of Logan Correctional Center. And in April, we asked correctional staff there, and they said like that should happen in 3 to 5 years. It's unclear. And for PNAC, we were there for a class, and we actually had some discussion with folks. It's a mixed bag, and I think it's important. I think the budget for this rebuild is around $900 million. And I think it's an opportunity for us to think about shutting down and then investing those $900 million in resources, and to think about like it's a $900 million rebuild, but then they're like the annual budgets. And if we were to take those funds and invest in people's lives and invest in, tangible resources, what would that look like instead? So I think it should be a shutdown and not a rebuild. And these sort of, I think it's also really difficult for folks inside to have this sort of uncertainty, of like, what's going to happen to us? Are we going to be moved further away? What's going to happen to our existing relationships? I think we have to invest more in terms of tangible resources and opportunities for people to get out and have lives where they're not experiencing these daily forms of harm. So, other questions? I don't know if I fully answered your questions, but these are sort of my quick responses. Mass release. I'll take mass release. Clemency is so hard to get. Any other questions? Oh, there was a question of tell us what brought us to this work. Yes, so starting in high school and undergrad, I did volunteer work and then and practice work in organizations for survivors of domestic and sexual violence. This continued during my master's level programming. And so I've worked with, and partly driven by close experiences with survivors of sexual and domestic violence. And when I was in Michigan for my master's program, I was able to go to the jail and meet with survivors, partly because of limitations on funding in terms of they weren't allowed to serve folks who were involved in the criminal legal system, especially those that had charges related to domestic violence. And in this work, I also started volunteering with the Battered Women's Clemency Project in Michigan, and with Carol, I can't remember her last name right now. It's really embarrassing. But anyway, I started working with that. And part of that work, we were looking at the legal case files of women who were serving very long sentences. And there were cases in which their experiences of domestic violence were not accounted for. So a lot of their acts were done as acts of self-defense, acts in the context of really experiencing major forms of violence and coercion and control by partners. And again, none of it recognized. And so they experienced that criminalization as a process. Through that volunteer project, I've been working with survivors. I had this very sort of simplistic maybe perspective. And the person that Carol had me interview was a woman serving a long-term sentence for infanticide. So actually killing her infant. And it was a much more complicated story. When I started my PhD program, I also had the opportunity to work with women serving time for violent offenses, and it was doing group work. And I was actually pregnant when I did it, and I was really moved particularly by the experiences of women serving life sentences. I remember one woman who, she passed her 45th birthday, and I was saying happy birthday, and she said, well, I've been in since I was 20, and I always wanted to be a mother. And even if I was to get out tomorrow, the chances of that happening are very, small, very low chances. And it made me think about all the losses that aren't included. And I also just, thinking about the amount of time spending in prison and the differences between those serving life sentences versus not serving life sentences weren't really recognizable. And then listening to life stories, folks have been experiencing violence and state neglect for most of their lives. So the injustice that's just sort of built up, and also in hearing them discuss their circumstances it really challenged a lot of my very simplistic narratives. And I think doing that work with women with life sentences, you know, so many of them said, like, don't forget about me. They won't help me pick out baby names, you know. I've been moved by their experiences, and I've never wanted to abandon them because they also shared their stories with me and shared their experiences. And for me, this is such complicated work. You know, and it's at the heart of, we see prisons as sites of like intensified systems of harm in all sorts of ways. And to me, it's personal, and it's also very, like, I can't turn away from it. I don't know how we fix all of it, quote unquote, fix all of it. I do believe in abolition. It's been great connecting with people at PNAP. It's been great connecting with people who will sit with the complexity and the realness, you know, that we can sit and talk about the griefs, and we can talk about forms of resistance, and we can also talk about, you know, we can talk about all those things, you know, that whenever, so whenever we went to the prison in April, women were, it was raining so hard, and women were talking about how the prison won't allow them to have coats with hoods anymore, and also how there's only one form of shoe that you can get, and how hard it is on their backs. And it's like, I appreciate having community to share that with, who is like, yes, that is part of this system of harm, and take it seriously. And also, it's been great, particularly with PNAP and the sort of Logan initiative, to really understand and see, like with the think tank at Stateville too, this idea of like folks as knowledge producers, as creatives, as scholars, and, you know, to reshape all these narratives. There's so much work to do. You know, there's so much to change, and there's no shortage of it. And so, in caring about like dismantling these systems of harm, to me, this is like a place that has me sort of hooked, in terms of, I feel like I can't ethically not do this work. I want to change how I do it and improve it, but I can't turn away from it. So I hope that makes sense. I know we're at
That
1
makes
o'clock.
perfect sense. Thank you so much for this amazing talk, Gina. We
Okay.
really appreciate you taking the time today.
Thank
And
you.
we will end it here.